Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I try my best to dispel this widespread perception that economics is too complicated for non-economists. And actually, it's very strange because people have very strong opinions about everything. Iraq war, gay marriage, does God exist, global warming, despite not having a degree in theology, not having a degree in energy economics, not having a degree in international relations. But when it comes to economics, people say, oh, yeah, it's for specialists, I don't know. But why, I say that this is only because the economists have been fantastically successful in making people believe that it is actually a lot more difficult than what it really is. So they'll tell you, oh, I could explain it to you, but then you don't understand. But in my previous book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, I stuck my neck out and said 95% of economics is common sense. Of course, made to look difficult with the use of jargon and mathematics. And even the remaining 5% can be understood, at least in its essence, if not in all technical details, if someone bothers to explain it to you in an accessible way. Now, being accessible doesn't mean that I'm trying to give you some kind of baby version of economics, idiot's guide to economics kind of, I take my readers very seriously and talk about all the fundamental issues in economics. What is economics? The ethical foundations of economics. Whether you can separate economics and politics. And how different ways of conceptualizing the economy affects the way we see the world. For example, people think that today's free market economics is a direct descendant of Adam Smith, but this is not true. In Adam Smith and other so-called classical economists, the society, the economy was conceptualized as being made up of classes, not individuals. And the whole theory evolved around how the way these different classes with different material interests behave affect the way capital is accumulated, the economy grows, income is distributed, and so on. Today in free market economics, there's only individual. When you tell people, oh, isn't there a class? They'll say, no, that's an old Marxist concept. But if that's the case, why do the marketing companies have all these class categories? Because they'll look at groups A, B, C, C1, C2, target the advertising according to the type of people who they are targeting. Anyway, so I talk about all these serious issues, and it also discusses some topics that are largely ignored in economic discussions today. It also tries to introduce the reader to lots of what I call real-life numbers. There's this perception that economics is a number subject. Actually, you grab a recent graduate and ask him or her what the national output of his or her country is. Probably 90% of the time, the guy will say, I don't know. They wouldn't know how long people work in, Germany or Greece. Let me tell you how important it is to know these real-life numbers. In the recent Eurozone crisis, a lot of people, especially the Germans, criticize the Greeks for being lazy. If you look at the working hours, Greeks work 30% longer than the Germans. So who's the lazy one? It's a matter of productivity. Greeks are unproductive. They are not lazy. No, and then you get to ask a whole load of questions, because individual productivity is not simply determined by how clever or how skillful you are. It has to do with infrastructure, institutions, the social trust, and all manner of things. And these are things that individuals cannot control. It's a collective responsibility, and if it's anyone's responsibility, the responsibility of the Greek elite, not Greek people. Of course, in this internet age, you don't need to know any of these numbers because you can always look them up. But you need to have some feel about these numbers, to know what to look for. Now, while emphasizing the importance of numbers, I emphasize how numbers in economics need to be taken with a pinch of salt and sometimes with a bag of salt. The German writer and scientist Johann Wolfgang von Goethe once famously said that everything factual is already a theory. Numbers don't fall from the sky. So, for example, when you say the unemployment is at 7%, what do you actually mean by unemployment? In the official statistical definition of unemployment, being unemployed means that you haven't worked for more than 1 hour per week. So actually the other side of it is that if you have worked for 1 hour, you are considered employed. A lot of people will say that's rubbish. In order to be counted as unemployed, you have to have willingness to work. No, because some people don't want to work. If you're in full-time education, for example, you probably don't want to work. And how do you prove that you are willing to work? You should have applied for a job in the last 4 weeks. So if you apply for your last job 5 weeks ago, you are counted as not willing to work, even when you are. And a lot of people in this environment has stopped applying for jobs because they have applied 200, 300 times and got rejected, and they are discouraged. Now, I'm not saying that the 4 weeks that is worse than 3 weeks or 5 weeks, but you have to know that these are all particular definitions. They all have a theory behind it. Now, many economists will tell you that economics is a science in which there's only one right theory. There are at least 9 different major schools of economics, and in these several more if you count minor schools or split the major ones into sub-schools, each with its own unique strengths and weaknesses. And for free market economics alone, you have 3 different kinds: classical economics, neoclassical economics, Austrian economics. We need all these diverse approaches to economics in order to fully understand our economy, because they all make certain assumptions. They all have different underlying political and ethical values. They have all sorts of different theories about how the economy grows and so on. The Singapore problem, or what I call life is stranger than fiction. If you read only the financial newspapers like the Wall Street Journal or the Economist magazine, you'll be only told that Singapore succeeded because of its free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors. This is partly true. I mean, they did have those things, but you will never be told that Singapore government owns nearly 90% of all the land. 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation, and a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, when the international average in that respect is only about 9%. Talking about Singapore, I always tell my students, look, give me one economic theory. It doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, Marxist, Austrian, Schumpeterian. Give me one economic theory that can explain Singapore. Well, there isn't. So you need to know these different theories to fully understand how a country like Singapore could succeed. I argue that we have to let 100 flowers bloom, let different economic theories develop in their own ways and enrich our understanding. Going one step further, I argue that we shouldn't let just 100 flowers bloom, but let them cross-fertilize. Actually, there are a lot of grounds on which this cross-fertilization can happen. Many theories, despite being politically at the opposite ends of the spectrum, share a lot of common understanding. The Marxists and the Austrians, for example, they may have completely opposite political views, but in terms of understanding how competition works, that they are much more similar to each other than to the neoclassical school. Austrians and Keynesians have locked horns since the 1930s, but actually they share this view that the world is a fundamentally uncertain place, and this rationality assumption of standard neoclassical economics doesn't work, and so on. So, I'm calling for this active cross-fertilization. So in this regard, my advice is that you should not be a man or a woman with a hammer by learning only one kind of economic theory, because whatever that theory is, once you believe that one theory is true, like the man with the hammer, you will start to see everything as a nail and bang everything. Yeah, it might work if it's a nail, that if you're lucky, But if it's an egg, it will be a disaster. So I say that you should get a Swiss knife. You should have a range of theories. And of course, you need some common sense to judge what tool to apply where. Most people of working age spend at least half of their waking hours in work, and a definite majority of those hours if you include the commuting hours. And if you are some unlucky black guy stuck in one of those far-flung townships in South Africa, you could be spending up to 6 hours a day commuting. Because the old apartheid regime didn't provide, and the new regimes that haven't quite made up for it didn't provide public transport for these townships. And these people have to commute with these minibuses, which are strangely called taxis in that country, run by these gangsters, charging an arm and a leg. But then they have to take it because that's the only way to get into town where their jobs are. So actually, we are spending a huge amount of time in work. I mean, especially these days, that if you're in white-collar jobs, that you never leave work because there's the email, there's Facebook, and there's the messages, and mobile phones. And despite all this, there's very little discussion of work in economics these days. I mean, how many economics books have you read that discuss work? In this dominant economic theory that is of today, that is neoclassical theory, people are mainly conceptualized as consumers. And work is considered as what these economists call disutility, that you have to put up with so that you can earn money with which you consume goods and services and then derive pleasure, or what they call utility. That's your aim, deriving pleasure from consumption. Work is only a means. But what happens in our workplace fundamentally affects us, not just our immediate physical and psychological well-being, but also our identity and our sense of self-worth and our self-fulfillment. This is why these days in many rich countries, a lot of people are very unhappy compared to, say, a couple of decades ago, despite the fact that they have higher income. Why? Because the work has become more stressful. Work intensity has increased. I mean, if you're working in Amazon warehouses, they track you down with GPS. I mean, there's that greater psychological pressure to perform, even if it's meeting stupid goals. All this performance-related pay and so on. No, I'm not against performance-related pay, but very often performance is defined with something that is easy to measure, which may not be the right the thing to pursue. We are having longer and more crowded commutes. We have less job security. People are a lot more unhappy, despite the fact that they have a higher income. But then, economists tell you, no, you should be happy. Britain today has 20% higher income than, say, 1975. Why aren't you happy? My book is not just an explanation of economic theories and facts. It's also a discussion about the role of economics in public life. And in this regard, I have 3 sets of observations to make. The first one is never trust an economist, and that includes me. Professional economists that like to say, we know what is correct. No, they don't have a monopoly over truth. I already told you that there are 9 different kinds of economic theory. The conclusion depends on which economist you talk to. And I argue that it is entirely possible for people who are not professional economists to have sound judgments on economic issues. I even argue that sometimes their judgments may even be better than those of professional economists because they may be more rooted in reality and less narrowly focused. And I argue that indeed the willingness on the part of the ordinary citizens to challenge professional economists and other experts is a foundation of democracy. If you really believe that all we have to do is to listen to the experts, to listen to the professional consensus of the experts, why do you need democracy? Let self-elected elites appoint each other and run the world. This is why a lot of people are unhappy with the European Union. I mean, them kind of imposing so-called technocratic governments in Italy and Greece. Mario Monti, I mean, I know him a bit. I mean, he's a very capable and economist and decent person, so I'll have him any day over Berlusconi. But, he wasn't properly elected. It's the counter to democracy to just parachute him into the Italian government. A lot of people said, yeah, but then, he's competent. But if that was the only excuse, you can make that excuse in China, in any dictatorial country. The second point is the Latin phrase, and it says, listen even to the other side. And I argue that this is the attitude you have to have in debating on economic issues. I'm not suggesting that you should have no opinion of your own. But what I'm trying to tell you is that given the complexity of the world and given the necessarily partial nature of all economic theories, you should be humble about the validity of your own favorite theory and should keep an open mind about it. Finally, throughout the book, even while I constantly make reform proposals, I emphasize how difficult it is to change the economic reality. Well, sometimes the reason is obvious. People who benefit from the status quo want to thwart change by any means, lobbying, bribery, media propaganda, and even violence. But the status quo often gets defended even without some people actively being evil. Think about the market system is that the rule is $1, one vote. So this means that the ability of those with less money to refuse undesirable options given to them is highly constrained. So for many poor workers, especially in developing countries, the choice is often working in factories with inhumane conditions or starving to death. In that sense, these people accept those outcomes, but then that doesn't mean that that's necessarily desirable. But still, it means that the status quo gets defended. Also, we can be susceptible to beliefs that are against our own interests. What happened when Barack Obama tried to reform the American medical insurance system, and there were all these pictures of old pensioners demonstrating against what they call Obamacare with placards saying things like, government hands off my Medicare. Well, except that Medicare is a government program. So with people like this, the insurance companies and the profit-making hospitals in America have a whale over time. They don't even have to defend themselves. Well, this is what the Marxists used to call false consciousness, or also known as the Matrix, the movie. But acknowledging the difficulties involved in changing the economic status quo should not make us give up the fight to create a better economy and better society. Yes, changes are difficult, but in the long run, if enough people fight for something hard enough, many impossible things can happen. And don't forget, 200 years ago, if you suggested that America should abolish slavery, you would have been branded at least unrealistic, and probably loony. 100 years ago, the British government put women in prison for asking for vote. A lot of women actually said, why do we need votes? We have our husbands and brothers to represent our views. 50 years ago, most of the founding fathers of today's developing nations were being hunted down by the British and the French as terrorists, including the founding fathers of Israel. Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, once said that we need to have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. You have to accept the difficulties of changing the status quo, but you have to believe that this can be done. And finally, as Nelson Mandela used to say, it always seems impossible until it is done.
I always think that the reason nobody wants to talk about production and nobody wants to talk about work because they don't want to talk about production is because we don't really know, if we are going to talk about production, what we produce. There's a kind of fear that the great Victorian days of discovery and production are over.
One has to define production in a more broad way. We are not just talking about material things. Services and ideas, they also get produced. Somehow, these things are things that are not concerns of the economists. what the engineers and managers and scientists that do is seriously wrong, because when you think about it, we live in a world like what we are living in only because of the changes in the domain of production, the Industrial Revolution. It's not because we become more efficient in doing deals. It's because we have become more efficient in making things that we live in a world like this. And totally ignoring this, I think, is a serious shortcoming of today's dominant school of economics. And, to give you a concrete example, in the 1980s, there's a big debate in the United States on how the US was falling behind Japan and other East Asian countries in the electronics industry and so on. But the free market economists came out and said, it doesn't really matter whether we produce microchips or potato chips as far as we make enough money. But this is not that true, because in the short run, it might be true. In the long run, what you produce fundamentally define your relative position in the world economy and your long-term standard of living and so on. And you cannot just ignore them.